Ayn Rand began this lecture by briefly reviewing an issue she discussed at length in the preceding lecture. That is, the issue of a story centering around a single incident.
Incident story, which would have not only just one issue involved as a main conflict, but also primarily one incident. And I mentioned that in a novel there will be many issues, naturally many incidents, but that the climax of a novel properly should resolve all of these issues, and that the main issues of a story in a well-constructed plot should all be involved and resolved in the final climax. And as an example of it, I wanted to analyze the climax of The Fountainhead in order to show you what kind of complexity and integration has to be applied in order to construct a proper climax. Now, the main issues, the story issues, or rather both plot, story, and philosophical, in The Fountainhead, concerning the main characters, were these. Now, there was the issue of Rourke against society. That was the main line. Therefore, the climax had to involve the resolution of that issue, the high point and the solution of it, one way or the other. It involved the conflict of Rourke against Dominic. And for Dominic specifically, her particular issue was what we call the malevolent universe. That is, it believes that the good cannot win on earth, that evil is powerful and will always win. The conflict between Rourke and Winant. And in this connection, Winant's belief that one has to rule men by force and that the pursuit of power is practical. The pursuit of power is practical, namely that by constructing a paper like the banner, he could achieve power for the purpose of his own values. That's his conflict and his main issue in the story. The contrast between Rourke and Kitty, which went through the whole book. The second-hander, his kind of career, the attempt to rise by using other people rather than one's own mind, versus the first-hander, the creative genius, the originator, such as Rourke. And for Keating personally, the issue of whether he could or could not succeed at his particular kind of career. And the issue of Toohey versus Rourke. That is, Toohey, a man who is deliberately and consciously committed to an evil philosophy of power. And the issue there was, could he destroy Rourke and everything that Rourke stands for, and could he achieve power by his kind of method? Now, those are the main issues in The Fountainhead. Do you observe in what manner the explosion of Cortlandt Holmes involves and solves all of them? For Rourke against society, that is the test. At the same time, it is the climax of Peter Keating's second-hand career, of attempting to rise by somebody else's achievement and what that did to him. In the case of Rourke, it allowed him to win. In the case of Keating, that was the final act of his hopeless destruction. In the issue of Rourke versus Dominic, that was the action that brought Dominic back to Rourke and that convinced her that her malevolent universe premise was wrong, that the good did win regardless of how terrible struggle against the evil and in what manner evil was impotent. That was her resolution. For Winant, when he attempts to defend Rourke in this case, that was the climax of his realization that his whole life policy was mistaken, that power of the kind that he sought, power over men, could only destroy his values, not serve them. And that was the complete end of Winant's ambition. The issue between Toohey and Rourke is quite obvious. This was the height of Toohey's power, that kind of project with everything that it implied politically and philosophically. Toohey mobilized all of the social or collective forces of public opinion that he could muster in the case of Cortlandt Holmes, and he lost. And after that, you could see that he would continue the same pattern, but with complete futility. He cannot win by his methods. Now observe, all of this had to be considered, and I had to devise a climax in action, mind you, not just in discussions or static scenes, but an action which would demonstrate and dramatize all these issues and solve them, show the ultimate triumph of which side wins, which side loses, and why, in all these individual conflicts and a great many smaller ones. If you keep this in mind, you will see the pattern of a very complex plot climax. I stress the word plot because I mean a climax in action, not merely in discussion. This is not to say that every novel necessarily has to have that many issues and that kind of complexity. But it's only an example which, if you understand the method by which all these issues were integrated here, you would be able, without too much trouble, to invent, construct really, climaxes for your own stories where fewer issues might be involved, and therefore they would be easier to integrate. Now, why do I assume that you will necessarily write novels with fewer issues? I don't mean this as a permanent verdict on your careers, but only that on a first novel you should not attempt anything as complex as The Fountainhead. Incidentally, when I say you should not, there are no should about a literary career. If you feel you can, go right ahead, but only in the sense of advice. It is almost too much to expect of yourself to have anything as complex for a first novel. However, it's possible I know someone who's going to do it. But don't look so blank. But again, it is all right to do it when one is ready. If you feel fairly shaky in the sense of not having yet integrated all the rules of plot structure or writing in general, don't start with something quite that complex. On the other hand, you don't have to start with a novel involving just one issue. That would be more a novelette or short story according to length. But all I cited this example for is to show you the pattern of extreme complexity. Then anything less than that, involving 2 or 3 issues, let us say, you should, in constructing your story, be able to integrate those main issues in one central event. And you know, of course, that when we speak of a climax, particularly for a novel, it doesn't have to literally take place in one day or one scene. That is more true of a stage play, where the climax does take place in one act of conflict or one specific scene. In a novel, if you remember in the earlier lectures, I gave you examples of it. A climax can involve several events. Like in Atlas Shrugged, it's actually 3 chapters, which constitute the climax of the whole novel. But what you have to remember is that even if it is several events which will serve as the climax of a novel, they have to be events of one sequence, which are all connected with each other, and you should make your main issues resolved in that part of the book, in those sequences or chapters which serve as the climax. It's in this sense that if I say in The Fountainhead, the climax is actually Cortlandt Holmes and everything that follows. That is the explosion of Cortlandt Holmes and Rourke's trial. This, as you see, is several chapters apart, and there's several incidents involved in this part of the story. But observe that it's all interconnected. In other words, the Cortlandt Holmes explosion is what sets off the climax. All the other events, such as how the different characters react to it, Winans' failure, and then to his activity, and the trial, and Rourke's victory, all that is involved in one central action, which is Cortlandt Holmes. So it's in that sense The climax may take a whole series of events, but they cannot be separated events. They have to be events logically, intrinsically connected. There is no rule about how long or short a climax has to be. What will determine that is the nature of the stories and the number of issues that the story involves and has to solve. Now the last of generalized rules or suggestions about plot construction. I must mention and stress very emphatically that when you plot a story, start your structure from the end. Now this will take a little explanation. You cannot start by thinking of the end of a story as the first step of a story. But once you are working on a theme or a set of characters, and you might even have certain conflicts or situations in mind, when you begin to construct the plot outline of a story, the first event to figure out is always the climax. Now you have to have some idea of the nature of the story, the theme, and the kind of subject you deal with. When that is clear in your mind, if the climax is not invented by you yet, don't start outlining a story from the beginning. First devise what kind of event will resolve and particularly, underscore, will dramatize the issues and the events of your story. Then you can construct the rest of your plot backwards. In effect, working from that climax on this kind of pattern, what sort of developments and events will you need in order to bring your characters to this point? This, incidentally, is a good example of the process of final causation versus efficient causation, which we discussed. In order to judge what kind of incidents, what kind of developments to include in your story, what is necessary and what would be irrelevant or superfluous, you have to know what is your purpose. In terms of story event, you have to know where you are going, and that will serve as the standard to decide what you need to prepare your climax and what is totally irrelevant. It's after you know what you have to achieve, when you know your climax, then you can begin to analyze what kind of steps you need to bring them to this point, and therefore you function by the process of efficient causation. You decide what kind of steps, one step leading to the other, one step serving as the efficient cause of the other, will, in their sum, lead your character logically to the events of the climax. Now there is, of course, no rule about what kind of element is the first germ of a story in your mind. And sometimes very fortunate writers are able to devise the climax first. In other words, you could get a very dramatic idea, which in effect will constitute the climax of a story, and then to construct the plot you work backwards, and that's sheer pleasure. That's very easy. But that does not always happen. In this sense, it's not a rule of technique or of how much you know. It's not a matter of that. That much is really a matter of pure accident in the sense of your own interests. Not accident in the sense of what kind of idea would occur to you, but accident from what end of a subject matter you are going to first think of a story. Meaning that the kind of story you will write, the kind of story you will choose to tell, will not be accidental at all. That will depend on the total of your artistic and philosophical premises. But whether someday you will decide to just think of a character who will be very clear to you, then add to it the kind of philosophical meaning he would express, then invent the story. Or whether you think of the abstract theme first, then devise your character as a story. or of a situation in conflict first. Then at the other elements, that is really accidental as far as any one writer is concerned. I mean, you don't have to aim to start a story from any end. You're absolutely free to start at any end, wherever the idea first attracts you. Because no matter where you start, it's like a circle. You will have to complete the circle and include all the other elements. But the only rule of which you can be certain is this, that when you come to the construction of your plot, if the climax is not yet clear in your mind, that is the issue which you have to dramatize, at least in general terms, in essence, first, before you start to outline the steps which you will arrive there. When I say outline, I don't mean that you necessarily have to write it all out. I find it very helpful, but that's not necessary. That's strictly optional. If you can carry it in your mind, fine. If the novel is very complex, it's helpful to write the outline before you start. But by write it out, I don't mean write a synopsis in objective terms that any outsider, anyone reading it, would understand. Personally, I always make my outlines in the briefest terms possible, what I call headline style. So that, for instance, on Atlas Shrugged, with all that complexity, I had every chapter outlined approximately, but loosely. And in the process of writing, I found moving certain events from one chapter to the other, or certain considerations that developed. But the content of all the events that finally went into the book was there in my outline, but it was there in this kind of form. For instance, let's say chapter 2 of part 1, Reardon, introduction of his family, introduction of his past struggle for Reardon metal, the bracelet. That's all. That's about, I think, almost verbatim what I had on the outline. Chapter, it's now 5, I think. Yeah, chapter 5, Francisco's and Agnes' childhood, period. Now, that's very brief. When I write it down that way, I know more specifically than this what will go under those general headings. But I mark them down only as vaguely or as specifically as I need to remember the progression and to get a generalized view, a bird's eye view of the whole structure. And again, here there is no rule about how vaguely and concisely or how detailedly you want to make your outline. The only rule is the purpose of outline, namely to keep the structure of your story very clear in your mind. And you would have to train yourself in your own terms how much you can carry in your head and how much you need to write down on paper to make you see the total. But the importance of an outline is to make you see in skeleton form the progression of your story and any omissions or any contradictions. If a story is complex, you might in a generalized way hold it in your mind and think it's all in order. Yet if you put it down on paper, you might discover what connections are missing, or are there dull stretches in the way you project the story. By dull stretches, I mean connecting sequences in which nothing in particular happens, or where your main line of development has in effect stopped, and there's nothing to carry it on to the next time you resume it. Blank spaces like that, or actual contradictions, or omissions of certain elements which will be necessary in order to make your climax and your later events dramatic. It's to judge those things that an outline is important. And it's literally the best metaphor for it, of the relationship of an outline to a novel is the blueprints in relationship to a building. And you know how much work would have to go into a skyscraper after the blueprint stage, but you know in what sense nobody can start making window trimmings and piling up girders without a blueprint. In order to judge what to do and what to put where and what are the stresses and strains and what weights, you have to have a basic blueprint, and the same exactly is true of the plot construction of a story. I think it's clear why you cannot start plotting a story, let alone writing it from the beginning, with no idea of the end. If, that is, we speak now of good plot structure writers. Though God knows most writers, particularly today, start precisely in this manner, and that is what's wrong with them, and their writing shows it. The manner of starting with some vague feeling or idea at the beginning and just seeing where it's going to take you. As a horrible example of what not to do, I heard once a woman writer. She was only a writer of kind of popular lending library fiction, not too good a writer, but she had worked it all her life. It was her career. I heard her make this kind of observation. When I asked her about her method of writing, she said very airily, "Oh, I throw a bunch of characters up in the air and I let them come down. And they act whichever way they act. I write the story." And her stories read exactly like that. Of course, in the same school of thought would be any of those modern writers who start with some assignment such as a mood of adolescence, or my own search for the meaning of life in prep school, or something like that. And that's all that they have as a theme. And then they start writing, and the selector, the standard of selection there is the mood of the moment. And then if the story, it's not even the story then in effect, but whichever the result is, the composition, does not mean anything, does not integrate or gel into anything, that epistemologically will be the reason. Among other reasons, among whichever bad premises the writer might have, technically, the reason of a story that just falls apart, that doesn't connect into anything, the kind of story where you don't know exactly what the total is or why one incident was included rather than another, and what is the purpose of it all. Behind that kind of hodgepodge is always a writer who started with an undefined plan and just wrote as his feeling dictated. In the same way as a life that anyone would attempt to live guided only by his feelings will be a meaningless chaos. So will a story. If you start with a very vague feel for what it is that you want to say, you're not going to have a good book, you're not going to have a good story, and certainly you will have no plot structure. You cannot start plotting from the beginning. You cannot start by inventing some kind of very dramatic beginning or some situation, the meaning of which you do not know at all, nor do you know where to take it from there on. It has been said about the theater that the trouble with the theater is that it's full of first acts. There are more people who can come up with a very intriguing first act, but they don't know what to do with the play thereafter. And actually, a good dramatist will start with the third act. By that, again, I don't mean that you have to write it out, that you write the third act first, or the climax of the story first. No, you don't have to write it out in any detailed form, but you have to have it in mind. You have to be clear on what is your third act in a play, or what is your climax in a novel. In our question period, last time, you remember someone mentioned that Mickey Spillane writes his ending of his stories first. Now, there is someone who has a marvelous plot sense, and who, as far as one can judge from his books, I've never met him, is not philosophical or introspective at all. So, without full philosophical identification, he has nevertheless arrived at the right premises about story structure, as that little bit of information would indicate to me as an absolute truth. Taken in conjunction with the kind of plot structures that you see in his novels, the information that he starts writing his books from the end is a proof that he has at least a sense, even if he hasn't identified it consciously, of how one goes about inventing a plot and constructing a story properly. Now, if you want to write out of sequence, that again is optional. As far as I'm able to determine, I can't think of any rules which would demand that you write when you come to the final writing, that you necessarily have to write from the first act or the first chapter. Some writers write out of sequence. They might write the end first, or write any particular scene which is clear to them, or which they particularly want to write, and then later scenes later. And sometimes it doesn't matter at all, provided they're skillful enough to hide the seams, provided if they write out of context, and if they write the end first, or write random scenes and then connect them, if they can hide the seams, if they can integrate and edit the total of the novel in such a way that the reader won't be able to know where the writer started, and it reads as if he started from the beginning, then that's perfectly permissible. However, in some books, as you probably notice, the strings show all over the place. And sometimes you don't even know where the other started writing or whether it matters, because nothing connects at all. But I'm now speaking of a connected, proper plot structure. If your outline is good, and you know exactly where you're going, the actual execution is up to you, in a sense of in what order you prefer to start writing. I personally always start at the beginning. I can make notes on scenes, or even sometimes part dialogue, in advance of the time I come to it, but I can't do the actual writing out of sequence because I deal with such complex issues that too many smaller subsidiary issues in each particular scene depends on what has actually been established earlier. And I could not possibly start in Atlas Shrugged, for instance, by writing a chapter somewhere in the middle of part 2, considering the number of events and issues that I have to keep in mind, and that I would only know in a generalized way in advance. Therefore, if I suddenly started to concretize something from the middle, while the concretes of the beginning were not yet set in my mind, except in a general way, I would never be able to connect the total, nor to write any scene fully and properly. Therefore, however, it's not only because of the complexity. I personally, as I say, always start my outlines from the end, but the actual writing from the beginning. Even on a simpler story like Anthem, which is a long, short story, I can write out of context because I'm always very aware of what has gone on before. If you notice my writing, one of my methods is that I like plans in the course of a story on which I will play later. That is, I will have references in a later scene to something that was established in the beginning. And I don't mean in major issues, but even in small things. As an example of it, for instance, in Atlas Shrugged, do you remember at the very end, in the last chapter, the last scene of Eddie Willers, where he's suddenly talking to Dagny in their childhood? And the reason why the chapter is called In the Name of the Best Within Us. Incidentally, of course, there's several reasons why that chapter is called that. But I'm not talking from the plot aspect. You remember I have him talk to Dagny using the kind of dialogue or answering his memory of their childhood planted in the very first chapter of the book. Well, I'm saying this simply as a boast because I like my ability to have done it. When I was writing that particular passage in chapter 1, But 11 years before I came to the last of it, I knew that that's what I was planting it for. I didn't know every detail of every chapter, but I knew that in the last, I knew my climax. I knew that in the end, Eddie Willis would end on the tracks of a stalled train, and that at that moment he will discover what it was that was the best within them. So that I was consciously planting a point there to play it back later. Now, if you remember also, I did the same with Halley's Fifth Concerto, that the description of it in chapter 1 is exactly the same as in the last chapter of the book. There it's copied verbatim, deliberately, for this purpose, that when you come to it the second time, it will have acquired, the same words will have acquired a totally different meaning for you. Not different meaning, but a full meaning. If at first it would be a somewhat generalized emotional abstraction, by the end it's a philosophical emotional summation. And just for my own curiosity, how many of you noticed that when you were reading it for the first time, what came across in the description of Halley's concerto at the end was much fuller than the same description in chapter 2. And also that it was the same description. How many of you noticed that? Second time. And Jim?
Not the first time. No, I knew that it was very, very much the same. I don't remember that it was verbatim.
Oh, no, that nobody could remember, except you could have a vague sense that it's verbatim. Then looking up, you would see that it is. No, you couldn't. I myself couldn't remember the exact words on that page. No, but did you recognize it as something familiar and that it now sounds different than what it was before? Only two of you. See?
I have to change it to that way I include myself too.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you mean in the sense that you wouldn't remember it verbatim?
Right.
But you did recognize the general, that it had been described before and that now it means differently. Incidentally, did you look it up to see whether it was verbatim or not? I don't mean to imply that you had to. You did?
I did. After I read it, I thought it was the same, and then I went and I looked.
Well, this I was asking just for my own verification because that is the effect I intended. That is, I wanted the reader to see the same description and to see how much more those same words will carry now as an expression of the stories that were between the 2 points. Because the Halley's Concerto, as you know, is a philosophical, artistic, musical summation of the ideas of the story, the symbol of or the hymn of the strikes throughout. That is why I used that particular device. Now, this was an aside only to illustrate a particular preference of mine for those playbacks and the kind of integration where you plant small touches in a certain scene and play on them, cash in on them, in effect, later. But that is not an absolute. Don't gather the idea that every good writer necessarily has to do that. This comes under the personal optional preference. I don't mean subjective. I don't mean that I don't have reasons for it. But I mean that the reasons are optional. The technique, the style of writing, which we'll discuss later under style, is so varied, so many combinations are possible, all of them good, that you're very careful not to take anything that I do as an abstract rule applying to all good writers. I will always indicate to you, of course, when a rule is abstract and when I mention something which is only personal preference. Now, in this sense of the small touches on which one plays are a personal preference. I mention it here only as one of the reasons why I don't like to write in any way when I come to the actual writing except from beginning on in chronological order. But as I said, it's not an absolute rule, and only rules are for each particular writer is whichever way he thinks he can do a better job whichever way is easier for him, provided his standard is always the final product. Provided he knows that in the final result he will be able to do it properly. And the only rule upon...
I have a question. Is it possible that you would have to wait until you had written out the whole of the main scene before you could know exactly what the hint was that you wanted to place in the first part?
A main scene, what do you mean?
For example, if you want to, for example, indicate something that you're going to use as the theme of the main scene later on, and you want to place a suggestion of this earlier in the novel, would it be possible that you wouldn't know where in the novel to place the hint until you had actually written out the whole scene?
Oh, yes. You mean the later scene or the earlier?
The later scene. And then you would have to go back and find...
And decide where to plant it. Oh, yes, certainly. Particularly if it's not a touch that would change the structure, the plot, or the progression of events. Oh, yes, you can always decide that later. That's what editing is for. I mean, your own editing. The number of times that you would go over a story after it's written. But what I started saying is that the only absolute rule in regard to this particular discussion, that is of was you write from the beginning or from the end or the middle. The only absolute rule is if you want to be plot writers, that is, have a good story structure, in plotting start from the end. If you have certain events or the beginning of the story is earlier, that's your first idea, when you begin to set your blueprints, to set your actual structure which you will then follow, always invent your climax first, then lead your events to it. If you attempt to set up a lot of interesting events that somehow seem to connect, but you don't know where you're going, and then you start deciding, well, how am I going now to tie it all together? You will not succeed. It will be the most incredibly mentally excruciating torture, and I doubt whether anyone could devise it that way. That is, plot a whole novel in exciting terms with no idea of where you're going, and then devise what kind of climax would solve it all. It would be an impossible undertaking. And so the only thing to remember here is when you're plotting a story as quickly as possible, get to your climax. Now this really, at least in essence, finishes now the discussion of what is plot and theme. Remember, that was the first department. Except that it leaves one question which is more psychological, technical than strictly literary, and that is how to make oneself become a plot writer. Was the question that is really responsible for this whole class. And that's the question, Cassie, which all of this course won't answer fully. Because that's really the top achievement of a writer after you've practiced a lot. But I can give you certain hints on how to condition your mind to become a plot writer. Now, I would still say one can do it, only you cannot learn it strictly by theory. That is, I could not give you a sufficient number of general rules and then sub-concrete rules to suddenly one day make you wake up with a plot talent. But it can be taught if you know the general rules and know the kind of mental set or mental exercise to give yourself, which will integrate into a plot ability. So before we go into characterization, I want to give you a few hints or exercises or general rules in this direction. And I want to preface it by explaining at this point why it is that so many people think of art as an emotional or mystical or some kind of activity which cannot be taught. You have very often heard that expression colloquially, is that art cannot be taught. And there is a sense in which I would agree with it. There is, I would say, writing cannot be taught. But in a totally different sense, it can. And I want to clarify where the two aspects come in and what is the difference. When we speak of learning courses in school, of sciences or physics or mathematics, history, which can be taught. What do we really mean? We mean simply the absorption of facts by what we call superstructure or conscious process. It is simply the learning of facts which you learn as such, and once you know them, you know them. That can be taught, it can be communicated. And now there are also physical skills which can be taught. For instance, typing or dancing, you can learn it from a teacher. But observe that there something is required more than merely listening to a factual lecture. You have to practice it. In order to type, you have to first be able to understand what is the nature of typing, and then to learn how you strike the keys and how you move your fingers. At first, all of it by a conscious effort, and very slowly. And what does learning to type consist of? Of bringing that skill to such familiarity that it becomes automatic. At first, you had to think of how to crook your finger, how far to reach for what letter, and how to strike the key, and how to keep in tempo, something incidentally which I'll never learn to this day. I can type, but I can't type rhythmically. That's just an aside. But most of you know how to type, and you know that that exactly was the process. At first, conscious and slow process, then exercise, practicing faster and faster. For what purpose? So that eventually when you look at a page of the copy which you have to type, your fingers do the rest instinctively, in quotes. Or rather, that is what would give people the idea that there are instincts. I mean that only as the most the best excuse I can give them for imagining that there are. Of course, that's not the real reasons. But when you hear people speak of instincts, that's the kind of experience which would make you believe that perhaps there are instincts. A certain skill becomes so automatic that it feels as if it's an instinct. By the time an experienced typist asks herself, how do I do it? She would just say, well, I just do it. No further thought is required. Her fingers do it almost without her conscious will. Same is true of dancing or of any playing golf or tennis. Any physical skill first is learned consciously, and you're in command of it when it feels automatic, when no further conscious attention is required, and your muscles or your fingers do the rest. Now, I pause on this analysis in order to illustrate for you what kind of automatic instincts have to be acquired in the realm of art. It isn't that the basic premises of art. I mean, art as a technique now, the art of writing, or of any other artistic endeavor. It isn't that it can be taught, but that in order for you to practice it, such complex integration is necessary that no teacher can supervise it for you or do it for you. All that the teacher can do is give you the elements that go into writing, and the suggestion is to a method of practicing or thinking, which will make you able to do it. But the amount of integration necessary is so immense that nothing will make you do it except your own practice. You can learn all the theory, but unless you have practiced it, that theory, unless you have actually written, and before that, unless you have thought in a certain kind of way, you will not be able to apply the rules. You remember we talked early in these lectures about what complexity goes into the writing of just one paragraph. You remember the lecture period, that paragraph there and selected, and where I gave my reasons for what went into it. Now you remember then I said I could not possibly have figured all that out consciously. But what happened is that I sit down to write, and this is the way the paragraph comes out, or approximately like that, and then with certain editing I can improve it. But I could not, knowing all the rules, which I told you then, and all the reasons, I could not figure out that paragraph by conscious effort. In the same way in which, if I learn a lesson in physics, I can pass an examination by stating the facts. I've memorized them, memorized and understood. But you see why the skill, the process of writing, cannot be taught. Not because it's a mystical talent, not because you're born with it, but because so complex an integration is involved that unless you work at it, you, no course, no teacher as such will be able to teach it. All that the teacher can do is give you the kind of essentials that would be helpful, or make you conscious, just as we're doing, of what sort of thing goes into writing. Call your attention to the kind of things which you read, to which you respond as readers, but which will take a very long time by yourself to identify, and identify in all that complexity. All that a literary teacher can do is save you that time, point out the identifications, to tell you what to look for, but to translate that knowledge into the ability to execute any one of the aspects of writing, whether it's the invention of a plot or a style of sentence construction. To do it, you will have to practice it yourself. And Darren, do you see clearer than why I said I will make that bet with you after I've seen a little of your writing? Because if you never try to do fiction at first attempt, it will be hard to judge. If I see how you integrate or what possible elements you might need, might take us a long time, but I can make a plot writer out of you if you will practice. Now, I won't go into too great detail at this time. We'll come back to any of those points over and over again from different aspects when we analyze your actual assignments. And as we read the different assignments and discuss them, you will see better the application of a great many of the things we've discussed so far. So that what we'll say will necessarily be generalized. But let me give you just a few of the basic general rules to condition your imagination, in fact, for plot writers. First, the general philosophical rule, which you need as people, as philosophers, as human beings. You need it as much as fiction writers, but this is an added incentive for you to be good thinkers. Namely, concretize all the abstractions that you deal with, or as many of them as you can. In your daily life, or thinking, or reading, you deal with very, very wide abstractions constantly. And I am certain that for most of you, a great many of those abstractions are still floating abstractions, meaning that you have some generalized and defined idea of how to concretize a certain abstraction. Or, if you're more careful thinkers, then your ideas may not be fully in the form of floating abstractions. That is, if I asked you to give me an example of any abstract concept that you use, you would be able to give me one or two examples, indicating that you understand the word you're using, but that would be all. It would be a semi-floating abstraction. That is, you wouldn't use words without any understanding of how to apply them to reality or what they mean in concrete, but you would have only very limited knowledge. In other words, if I asked you, what do you mean by independence, you might be able to tell me, well, it's a man who sings for himself. That's quite a good definition. That's one good concrete. That's by no means all that's necessary to state concretely in order to understand such an abstraction as independence. What I mean by concretizing your abstractions is try as often as you can, as you have time to, or as you catch yourself in the process of using mentally, or hearing, or reading, floating abstractions, or semi-floating. That is, abstract concepts which you cannot readily concretize. Or very wide abstractions, covering in fact hundreds and thousands of concretes, for concretes in different aspects, mind you, for which you might have in your mind only one or two examples and no more. Catch those concepts in your mind and learn to concretize them. Learn to project in ultimate action what any abstraction means. As a guide for it, keep remembering that you're Aristotelian and not Platonist, namely that nothing exists but concretes. Abstractions do not exist. Any word which you use, with which you might be thoroughly familiar, nevertheless, if every word is an abstraction, and that abstraction as such does not exist. Only concretes exists. You will find the necessity to remind yourself that you are Aristotelian is particularly important in regard to any abstraction dealing with human beings. Because in relation to men, all the words, all the concepts which serve as emotional abstractions, well, any intelligent adult will think he understands. Nobody here is of so low a rationality that he would use totally floating abstractions. But you would be surprised if you attempt to concretize it, how imperfect your understanding is. By that I mean such terms as love, hate, fear, anger, any emotion, any moral premise about men, like independence or dependence, selfishness or unselfishness. Anything that you can think of, any abstract concept pertaining to men or human emotions or human actions and values, all of you do have some kind of concrete grasp, at least since you've studied our philosophy, and I'm sure before that. But if you attempt now to tell yourself, how many concretes do you have under these abstractions, and in what manner would you reduce them back to their source, namely to concrete persons, to concrete physical reality? You'll be surprised that you will not come too easily. For instance, if you say love, well, everybody knows what love is. Now that's tremendously vague abstractions, you know. Try to bring it down to earth. Well, the first step would be to say it's an emotion of appreciation that a human being feels for a value. Now, fine, that's a good philosophical definition. You know, of course, that that's not concrete yet, because that's also it's only definition, but it's a very abstract definition. To make it concrete, you have to project what does it mean in a human being. Not only how does it feel, but how would you know that another human being experiences? As a writer, what would it mean to observe love? What does that abstraction come down to in the concrete? Not only introspectively, not only the feeling that you might be able to experience and project, but how would you know it in other people? Because as a writer, you have to know how to project any one of your abstract concepts in specific concretes. That you know it inwardly is not enough. You have to make your reader know it, and to make your reader know it, you have to remember that he can only grasp it from the outside by some kind of physical means, in some kind of words or actions. Now then concretize to yourself, what do you think love means in Aristotelian concretes? In other words, if a man or a woman is in love, what kind of actions would that involve? What kind of words? What would they seek? Why would they seek it? That is what I mean by concrete reality, for which love is only a very wide abstraction. Now, I don't advise you to start systematically doing that with all the concepts that you deal with. That would be an impossible job. Do it in any way you wish or in any order. Either do it for such abstractions as you deal with most or as interest you most, or simply at random, whenever you catch yourself mentally dealing with some kind of concept which really is not fully concretized in your mind, pause and concretize it. Do that in idle moments on a bus or while brushing your hair or teeth or whenever your mind is unemployed. Don't have to do it systematically. If you do it systematically, fine, but I don't mean to imply that you have to sit for hours preparing that kind of exercise. I recommend this as a general policy. Train your mind to concretize every abstraction. As I said, it's terribly important for you as human beings anyway, and as thinkers. But for a writer, what it does is it stores in your subconscious a tremendous amount of concrete and a clear first-hand understanding for the kind of issues which you will have to present in action. Since you will be dealing mainly with human beings, I recommend that you start with all those abstractions that all writers deal with, and very few understand fully in concrete terms. That is, all abstractions pertaining to emotions, to values, to virtues, to actions. In order to have a well-balanced mind, in effect, you should be as clear on all concepts. But since you have to start somewhere as a writer, it would help you to start with the concepts and the abstractions that deal with human beings. Incidentally, like with typing, it is only at first that you would have to do it by conscious, measured steps. Eventually, it will become a mental habit. It will become automatic and will help you with all the rest of your thinking in non-literary terms. Because in fact, however, your writing will involve all your thinking and all of your premises. But for specifically literary purposes, if you want to be able to invent plot, the first requisite is not to carry floating abstractions in your mind. Now, coming to strictly literary problem, do you see what this kind of exercise will do for you? Once you are accustomed to see every abstraction in its concrete terms, is to know what every abstract word really stands for, you will learn how to translate abstract ideas or generalized themes into action. Because action is concrete and physical. Action is Aristotelian. Abstractions do not act, and nobody could write a plot story on a Platonic philosophy. When you deal with action, you deal with the concretization of ideas. And if you want to know how to invent a story, well, any story that you would start wanting to write, whether it's from a general feeling or from a very abstract theme, ultimately it will come to what? To concretizing the particular feeling or theme or idea that you start with. Meaning that the particular theme or feeling, once you name the feeling, of course, or abstract philosophical concept that you want to write a story about, start it in your mind, when you give yourself the assignment, as an abstraction. Now, in order to know how to put that abstraction into a plot, you have to know a tremendous amount of concrete in your mind. To have it there at your instinctive call, so that when you need to dramatize it, your subconscious will do the kind of integration and selection that will pick out of those concrete that which is relevant. So if you tell yourself, for instance, I want a conflict between individualism and collectivism, you have to be terribly clear on countless, I literally think probably hundreds of thousands of concrete meanings that those words have in personal, political, and philosophical terms. You have to be able to name those things to yourself, if necessary. Now, yet you can't do that. It might take you years if you start that exercise when you're about ready to invent a story on the theme of individual versus collectivism. But if you have all your abstractions in your mind in that concretized form, then when you come to this theme, that is where your subconscious will integrate and select out of all the concretizations you've stored away the kind of events that will dramatize it. You would not have then, by conscious effort, to figure out if Rourke is an individualist. Well, of course, he wouldn't do a housing project. But maybe he would do it under what conditions? Well, what would an individualist do, and what do I mean by individualist? See, you would get bogged down on that alone, let alone be able to integrate the sort of thing I was illustrating about the climax of the fountainhead. I didn't go through that process. In fact, the idea of that climax hit me like Newton's apple, only, like in that case, as someone said once, or I read that in a book, so I won't take credit for it, accidents happen to those who deserve them. In other words, I had to do a tremendous lot of thinking, not only long before the fountainhead, but on the outline of and the theme of the fountainhead. And I was working on what would be the climax for it after I had the general direction of the story and the main characters. And it's on one particular lunchtime, I can remember where and in what drugstore, I was thinking of all the elements for the climax, and suddenly the housing project and how it would relate to Rourke and Keating. It's just kind of like that, in one flash. Now, this is the sort of thing which most writers who are not introspective will tell you, writing is a mystical talent, it just comes to me, I don't know where it came from. But the one value I can be to you is that because I am a good introspective and a rationalist, I can tell you exactly how those things happen. What I can't tell, what you won't be able to tell, is the subconscious connections which go on in your mind preceding the moment when an idea strikes you. But what I do know, and you will discover, is that your subconscious does work somewhat like a univac. And when you set the right stops, if you have fed the right figures into it, it'll give you the answer. You won't have to know the wires connect inside. What you will know is that you'll get the result if you set the numbers in a certain way. And it's in that sense that I mean concretize all your abstractions and fill your mind with your subconscious with as many concrete meanings to everything you deal with as you can. I don't mean memorize it. I mean concretize it, and once you're in control of it, you can forget it. Your subconscious won't forget it. It's there for the time when dealing with some complex thing and needing a very complex integration, you will have to only press the buttons of your univac in the sense of the specific assignment. You'll have to, in effect, say, I need a climax that will resolve issues such and such, problem so and so. Now, as you think of it, you think in abstractions. What will make your subconscious connect is the fact that those abstractions are not mere tags in your mind. They are not mere floating abstractions without any content. What will make your imagination productive is the fact that if your abstractions are fully in your control, if they're not floating abstractions, you will be able to give that order to your mind. And sooner or later, not automatically, not immediately, but depending on the complexity of the problem, if the problem you've given yourself is within the confines of your knowledge, your subconscious will integrate it and it will give you the answer. But there will be nothing mystical about it. Your dexterity with plot answers and structure will depend on how well your abstractions are concretized in your mind. Now you see what will be important here. You have to be able to work again, like all good rationalists should in any realm, to work backward and forward from the abstract to the concrete and to be completely at home in it. In other words, you should be able to concretize any abstractions that you deal with and vice versa, to draw the abstraction from any concrete that you deal with. You should train yourself how to see the abstract meaning or that which a series of concretes have in common, whether people or events or character traits or whichever. You should be constantly, creatively drawing abstractions of your own. As you look at people or you wonder about people, what makes them tick, or why do they act as they do, you're dealing in a process of abstraction. You have to, you're observing certain concretes, and then you decide the explanation is so-and-so. I have seen a number of people do this and that. The premise behind it is such and such. When you do this kind of thinking, it simply means that you are abstracting for a general principle or concept from a number of concretes. And you have to be thoroughly at home in that if you want your observations to be valuable to you as future writers. If you don't do that, you might lose a tremendous amount of good material. Thus, for instance, you might be very observant. You might very often observe characteristic things that people do that express certain things that might be very good to put in writing. You might be perceptive and understand any particular individual that you deal with, or observe in certain situations that you understand what makes that mind work, or what goes on in the person you're dealing with. But if you observe only this much and store it in your subconscious in that form, it's lost, because it's only a concrete observation. You have observed something or learned something in this particular instance. It's tied to nothing else and it will be of no value to you. But if you do the same kind of observing and tie it to abstractions, that is, for instance, let us say you observe that someone is very nastily aggressive, and at the same time you see that the person is very frightened and uncertain. And you might draw the conclusion, according to whichever is the evidence, that here is a person who is putting on a show. Here is someone who is really a coward and who is aggressive as a matter of defense. Now that's classifying a concrete observation under abstractions. That is the kind of observation which will be valuable for you when you later come to characterization of how to project certain traits, again, in action. More than that, if you are thoroughly at home as a mental habit in the process of always concretizing your abstractions and vice versa, always classifying the concretes that you observe under either known abstractions, that is, abstractions known to you, or forming new abstractions, new concepts and principles of your own. If you're in that habit, here is the kind of skill you will acquire in relation to plot. You will know how to translate an abstract theme into action, and vice versa, how to attach an abstract meaning to an action idea. Let's suppose you might have an idea for a story which is only a plot idea, because that's the most valuable one to get. But maybe at first glance it has no particular philosophical meaning, just the idea of some dramatic situation. If the process from abstract to concrete and back again is clear to you, you will be immediately able to see what is the abstract meaning of this kind of conflict or this kind of situation. You might start with a marvelous plot idea and develop it into a very serious plot and philosophical story. Or vice versa, if you start, as I know so many of you want to start with, philosophical abstractions, and you want to illustrate malevolent universe, or any of the concepts you've learned, if you're clear and at home in the process of concretizing your abstraction, you will have a variety of ideas to choose, not necessarily a whole plot constructed immediately, no, but you will be able to translate that abstraction, such as malevolent universe, into the kind of concrete events and actions that people do if their premise is malevolent universe. From those events and actions, you will be able to devise a conflict, a plot, and a climax. But if you have to do that process by hand, meaning cranking by hand consciously the meaning of every abstraction, because you're not yet at home in that abstract concrete relationship, it'll take you forever and it'll seem like an impossible problem. Only when your whole epistemology is geared to dance back and forth, in effect, and I mean dance, it has to have that kind of ease, and it comes only from practice, just as any other skill. When you're at home with that, then no matter at what end you start, whether it's an action idea that you first think of or an abstract idea, you will be able to give the philosophical meaning to the action, or the action story to the philosophical idea. It's again like using a metaphor like a mind-body relationship. Whether you start with the body, which is the action, or the soul, which is the abstract theme, in either case be able to have it completely integrated, so that none of your stories will be just meaningless actions with no inner theme and no meaning, nor will they be floating abstractions of philosophizing on the age of non-fiction with no real plot, no real story. A proper integration, you see, of idea to action is, in effect, the sign of an epistemology which doesn't have the mind and body split, which isn't confined just to thinking in terms of physical concretes or just in terms of floating abstractions. Now, I think we won't get to characterization today because we have only 10 minutes before the broadcast, and I just have a few more points to finish on this. On these exercises, the relationship of the abstract to the concrete and vice versa, as I said, are wider than a writer's premises, but they are imperatives in fact for all rational human beings, but you can see from what viewpoint they're particularly valuable to a writer, more specifically a plot writer. Now, the next point is one which applies primarily and exclusively to plot writers, and which will depend on your being at home in the first part. When you're at home in the relationship of abstractions to concrete, the next point, the real fiction writer's point, is learn to think in terms of conflict. You remember what I said when we discussed plot structure about the importance of conflict and why all proper plot situations have to do with an issue of conflict of important values between two people and or within one man. You remember that. Now, learn to think, have your attention set and receptive and focused on seeing possible situation conflicts. In anything to do with people, in anything you read, a rather valuable exercise in this respect is that when you go to modern movies or watch television or read modern books, which are plotless or very inept, when and if they have a plot, predominantly, with very rare exceptions, learn to correct them mentally if you can. That is, set your mind on this kind of premise. If you watch a story that begins as if it might be interesting and then peters out, as most stories do today, see what you could have done with that beginning, which to you seemed promising. Be on the lookout for how you could have turned that same story into a real conflict or a real situation. That sort of wasted opportunity you will encounter in almost every modern story. Also, some are no good even for this kind of purpose because they don't have even the rudiments of anything resembling a plot. But more often you'll see modern writers starting with some idea which might have been good, but because of their philosophies and also in great part, I'm sure, because of the training they get in college literary courses where plot is frowned upon and it's relegated to cheap detective fiction or comic strips, and young people are taught to concentrate on their feelings, their souls, and some kind of elegance of style, God knows by what standard, and all arbitrary and mystical. The writers are trained away from developing any plot feeling, even if they had one, or any plot premises. Therefore, what you'll see in modern dramas very often is an idea that could have been a good dramatic idea that just peters out in some loose scenes of some undefined emotions and no ending and no beginning. Now, whenever you watch that sort of thing, try as an exercise to see if some elements that interest you, how you could have turned it into a conflict and a situation. Now, I certainly don't mean plagiarism, but that's not what's involved. Not to rewrite someone else's story and then steal it and actually make a story out of it. I mean only as a mental exercise. It may not be plots that you would ever want to use anyway, but only as a training of how to give a purposeful plot structure to some shapeless presentation of undefined events and people. And as I say, the lead to doing that is think in terms of conflict. How you could turn those ideas into an important conflict of important values or issues. And in this conclusion, I will tell you again, it will be a repetition for those of you who have heard it in our preliminary sessions. One conversation I once had with Cecil DeMille that I found very valuable at the start of my career, and some of you have heard it, I will repeat it for the benefit of the others. This was my very first year in Hollywood, and I was 22 then. By that time, I was 21 when I arrived, but at the time of that conversation, it was somewhere within that first year. Now, I already, as far as I can judge now in retrospect, had quite a strong plot sense developed, but with no identification. In other words, I didn't know really what made a good plot story, except that I knew how to recognize. And Cecil DeMille, whom I had met then, told me once what he considered the essence of a story. Incidentally, he saw that it was something that could not be taught. It's either you know you have it or you don't. Either you understand what I mean or you won't. Meaning that he himself didn't know how to explain it, but he certainly had the right idea. And I found it very valuable in the sense that it clarified and dramatized something for me. He said that a good story depends on what he calls a situation. And a situation is really a complicated form of conflict. He said the best stories are the ones that can be told in one sentence. Not the whole story, of course, but he meant the essence, the conflict or situation of a story can be told in one sentence. He said if it can be done, then it's a good plot story. And he said that one of his most successful pictures, he bought the story from one sentence in a telegram. The picture was one of his great silent day successes. It was a very big success. And it was called Manslaughter. I think it was produced before most of you were born. I, in fact, saw it in Europe before I came here. It was years ago. But he told me how he happened to buy the story. It was, I believe, either a magazine serial or a stage play originally. And he said a friend of his wired to him in Hollywood, wired from New York, advising him to buy this story for the screen. And he said the friend included only one sentence, what the story was about, and Emil bought it on the ground of that telegram. It was a very good story and a big success on the screen. The sentence was this. It's the story of a spoiled heiress who kills a child in an automobile accident and is sent to jail. The man who has to prosecute her at the trial is her fiancé, who is very earnest and righteous, in effect, young district attorney. Now that's all the Emil knew about the story, and he bought it. I said it here to show you why he was right and what it was that made this kind of sentence contain all the elements of a good story. Because you see the situation, the conflict is right there. Once you see, if you have that much of a lead for a story, you know what kind of events would have to be constructed in order to lead the characters to that kind of setup and what kind of possibilities there are as a consequence of this sort of conflict. Not that you see all the events immediately. Great many possibilities are involved, great many choices, but what you see is the possibility of a dramatically constructed progression to this kind of climax and of whichever conclusion follows from it. You see, the dramatic possibilities are inherent right there in this kind of situation. Now, anyone starting a story with that kind of idea is safe dramatically. It would take a very bad writer to ruin it, because all the elements of drama are there. You don't always start with that kind of essential situation, but that's what you have to aim at. Learn how to construct this type of situation in your mind, whether just on your own or, as I said, reading plotless books or watching plotless television or movies or the theater. Learn how, out of loose elements, you could construct a real conflict of values, an issue, a situation of this sort, not literally of this sort, but of this kind of dramatic possibilities. Now, that would be the first and probably the most important step towards becoming a plot writer. One more lead. These are technical. The last lead is emotional. When you try to imagine events, ask yourself, what kind of events would you like to see happen? That is tapping your emotions and your values. Because of any possible kind of event, granting an abstract idea of a conflict, what will give you a very reliable selector, a dramatic selector, would be your own values and your own personal, even subjective imagination. When I say subjective, I don't mean that it's literally mystical. I mean, it will feel subjective to you. When you ask yourself that question, don't start by censoring yourself and checking yourself against our morality. Simply tap your emotions in this sense. You can later judge whether they're right or wrong. Ask yourself, what is it you would like to see happen? What kind of events or conflicts would you find interesting when you're trying to dramatize an abstract scene? You'll be surprised how productive that would be. Take yourself selfishly as the one who will have to enjoy the spectacle of certain kind of events. See what kind of events would you like. Not what kind would make the best propaganda. Not what kind your potential audience might like. No, what you personally would like to see happen in the most absolutist kind of way. You only have to please yourself. That is the best springboard or the best incentive to give you for inventing events. Special lecture on plot, January 17, 1959. Now, if you remember, as a result of our small test on the example of my story, Good Copy, what became obvious was that you all had difficulty with the concept of plot scene. You're not too clear on what constitutes a plot scene, and therefore necessarily will have trouble in constructing a plot. So today's lecture will be devoted to chewing in details as much as I can tell you about plot themes. I will first give you the theoretical part of it, and then we'll have a question period, and ask me any questions you wish, but preferably on this issue, because I know that all of you have trouble with the concept of plot and how to go about to construct it. Now, first remember that our definition of plot is a purposeful progression of events. And here I want you to be clear on two aspects. That the purposeful has two meanings. One, that the author has to be purposeful in the kind of events that he selects to have an integrated story. And the other, of course, is that the characters have to be purposeful. Now you remember we discussed that in detail. You know in what sense characters have to be purposeful, in the sense of free will, in the sense of holding values and setting themselves goals, and being able to achieve these values or to struggle for them. You remember those issues. Therefore, you could not write a plot story on a deterministic premise about a purposeless character, or a character who didn't believe he could hold values or achieve purposes. But what we're concerned with today primarily is the first meaning of the word purposeful, and namely the purposeful author. How an author sets himself a purpose in constructing a plot. Remember also that I'm talking today only about plot and not about theme. That is, if your purpose in writing a story is an abstract philosophical theme or a message of some kind, that is a different issue. If you remember our lectures, the question of theme is separate and optional. You don't have to have a philosophical message, but to have a good story, you have to have a plot. Therefore, how you translate an abstract message into a plot is a separate issue, which we discussed. Today, we're talking only about the necessity of having a plot. Therefore, when I talk about an author's purpose, I take it up from the stage where an author decides to construct a story. The relationship of the plot to your theme, and to have and the choice of events to illustrate your theme is a different issue. But whether you have a theme or simply start with a plot story, you come to the point where you have to decide on your plot theme. If you have a message, that plot theme will have to be determined by your message or by your philosophical theme. If you don't, you start with the plot theme. But you realize that in either case, the proper literary work starts when you begin to construct a plot. And when you're on that part of the job, the plot comes above your message. By which I don't mean that you have to then decide on some bad plot which contradicts your message. I only mean that while you're constructing the plot has to be your sole consideration. If it doesn't fit your message, then you have to select a different plot. But while you're on the plot construction, it doesn't matter what your philosophy is, as far as the purely plot issues go. The rule for the plot construction of a story with a message or without a message will be the same. Therefore, here when I talk about the purpose of the author, I talk only about the plot purpose. Here we talk about you not as philosopher, but as dramatist. I might remember one definition, which is very important, from the lectures. When I was explaining to you the progression from purpose to climax, and I copied the sentence again to repeat it to you. I said that purpose presupposes the necessity to achieve it. Therefore struggle, therefore conflict, therefore climax. You probably remember that sentence. What struck me as I was listening to you and in reading your works is that the main confusion actually is in the concept of conflict and of value. Those two concepts are not yet clear to you, particularly not conflict. And without an understanding of what is a conflict, you won't be able to construct a plot. Therefore, first of all, we shall discuss in detail the nature of conflict. Now, to begin with, you must remember that any desire is a value. It is quite a different question whether it's a right value or the wrong value, rational or irrational. Anything that a man desires, to the extent to which he acts to achieve it is a value, at least to him. Therefore, when we say that a conflict has to be a conflict of values, it doesn't mean some kind of vast philosophical abstraction. It means any desire involved in a person's life or character. I think too many of you have the idea that conflict of values means a clash between two characters of opposite philosophies and nothing less. Well, for purposes of plot construction, you better forget wide philosophical issues, because every issue, everything that a man wants is a value as far as his actions are concerned, and that's what you have to remember in judging whether you have a proper plot conflict or not. Now let me give you the simplest example of a conflict of values. If you look at a menu in a restaurant and decide whether you're going to have ice cream or cake for dessert, that is a conflict of values. Because if you like both ice cream and cake and would not be able to eat both, you have in that moment to decide which one you will choose. If you don't like cake and only like ice cream, there's no conflict. If there are two desserts that you like, there is a momentary conflict of values and you decide on one. Now that's not the kind of conflict on which you could build a story, because the values involved are not important and the loss of one or the other is not important. But what you must remember very clearly is that even in that small issue, there is a clash of values. Everything where your choice is involved, every action or situation in which a man has to choose necessarily involves values. I say that because if you remember, on the occasion when we read Good Copy, say that it was a story in which there was no conflict of values. Well, obviously, he thought that to have a conflict of values, you have to have at least communism versus capitalism. Nothing less would do. The point here is that every issue where a man chooses is a conflict of values. Now, how does it apply to plot construction? The first thing to remember is that the values involved and the conflict involved should be at least important enough to be of some interest to the character, to the author, and to the reader. That the conflict should have some significance. A conflict over choice of dessert obviously would not do. Now, look at dramatic literature and ask yourself this. Why is it that stories about criminals usually form good plot structure, and that the crudest, most primitive, but most often used form for suspense drama? In fact, today, unfortunately, on TV, for instance, we have nothing but criminal stories if we want a plot story. It's the easiest form of creating a plot. Now, I wonder how many of you will understand why. The point there is this, that a criminal, by definition, is a character open to dramatic conflict of values. Thus, he wants to rob a bank, let us say. Now, he wants the loot. At the same time, he wants safety. He does not want to be caught and arrested. He wants to escape. He wants both his safety and the product of an action which makes safety impossible for him or endangers his safety. Therefore, the moment you introduce a crime into a story, you already have a very rudimentary, very primitive, but proper form of a conflict of serious values. Now, to make this clearer to you, I'll ask you to project in your mind a story in which you have a character who is a criminal. Let's say he is a bank robber, but he does not care whether he's arrested or not. He's so indifferent that he might decide that, he'll have security in jail, so it doesn't matter. And he doesn't attempt to hide or to escape. It would be a totally static story. There would be no plot possible. Or put the same character in some situation in a story where, let's say he's in a city where there are no policemen, so that criminals are not pursued. And he robs the bank, but nobody intends to do anything about it. You won't be able to construct a story. It's a realization like that that you have to keep in mind when you weigh what is a conflict. Until you realize that the specific purpose of a character is not all that's involved. Until you realize you have to identify all the conflicts that that purpose necessarily engenders, you won't be able to appreciate what makes a good situation and what doesn't. For instance, if you think of a criminal, you might say, well, his only purpose is to rob. That's not yet a conflict. But that's where you have to remember the full context and remember that his purpose is also to escape. And whenever you try to identify in your mind any situation that you project, it's this kind of detailed understanding of the values which a person would have in reason and in what manner they would clash that will permit you to invent much better plot situations. Now, going back, remember the story Good Copy, he said there was no clash of values, no conflict of values. He obviously meant that the characters didn't have any kind of opposite philosophies. Now, I will ask you to identify in plot terms what conflicts were involved and why that was a good plot story. Just naming some of the chief ones. For instance, Lloyd, the main character, is a newspaper man. He wants excitement in order to further his career, so he fakes or stages a kidnapping. Without going any further, you already have a conflict because he puts himself in a position where he might be arrested, disgraced, and therefore his career would be ended. And by merely committing that action, he's already on the way to a dramatic situation because there is the clash between his interest as a newspaperman and the possibility of being discovered. That's already conflict, but it's not a very complicated conflict. The next step is that he falls in love with the girl whom he has kidnapped, and she falls in love with him. Now there is a new clash of values. Since he has done something which is evil against her, at least he would identify it as evil since he has kidnapped her, there will be a clash, a conflict between the realization of what values this kidnapping is to him and to his career and his love for the girl. That's the next conflict. When a real criminal enters the scene and steals the girl from him, he's put in the top conflict, which is to surrender himself, to destroy his career, to go to jail, or to save the girl. Therefore, there he has the conflict between his career ultimately and his love for the girl. When you have this kind of clash of interests, that is a plot scene. Try now to consider this story without any of these elements, or omitting some. Supposing he had kidnapped some adult man who was a nasty character and a villain, and he was holding him prisoner. There will be much less conflict in that, because if he didn't care about his prisoner, he's in a much easier position. If then the real criminal steals this man prisoner from him, well, the newspaperman might decide to go to the police and might not. In either case, not too much is involved. He might conceivably send an anonymous tip to the police, but never risk his own arrest in order to save this nasty man for whom he feels nothing. Therefore, his conflict is very superficial. It will be merely an annoyance that some criminal spoiled his original plan. But if that criminal steals the girl he loves, that is a much more complex, a much more serious conflict. Or supposing Laurie was a real criminal and stole the girl and fell in love with her, well, then it's a totally different conflict, because then it isn't endangering his career if he decides now to confess and to be arrested. But the conflict then would be to redeem himself in her eyes, which is not too much of a conflict if she's already fallen in love with him. For again, there will be no real clash. whenever you consider the plot of any story you read, and more importantly, whenever you consider how to construct your own plot, these are the kind of considerations you have to remember. You have to remember at what points and in how many ways do your characters entertain conflicts, not only with one another, but within themselves. Now, a plot theme is a central conflict that will determine the events of your plot. And the main question on is what kind of conflict can serve as a plot theme. As you've observed already in what we are discussing, some conflicts are conflicts, but are so simple and so primitive, so one line in effect, that not much of a story can result. Why? Because not too much is at stake. What now I want you to see and to recognize is what kind of central conflict can serve as a plot theme. What kind of an idea, when you get it, can assure you that you have actually the seed to develop a whole plot structure. And the best way to see that is from the inside. In other words, today, instead of making you identify a plot theme on a story which is already made, on a story which you hear, let's take it from the other side, and I'll show you the manner in which a plot theme works from the inside. In other words, let's try to start a story from scratch, and you will see why you need a plot theme. Because now, let us suppose you're starting a story. You've decided that you're going now to make an outline, and you face a total blank paper and a blank mind. And you can't start from nowhere. You have to start doing something. Particularly if you know that you have to construct a purposeful progression of events. And the question is, what kind of an idea will be sufficient to give you a purposeful progression, to give you any progression at all? So let's say now, for instance, you'll decide on your background, and let's say you want to do a story about the Middle Ages, a costume drama laid in the Middle Ages. If you define only that, as just the background, you will find yourself again in the position of a blank, because from here on you can do anything. You can take any aspect of the Middle Ages, you can take any set of characters, and incidentally, as a philosophical aside, I want you to realize that this is a good example of the fact that if something can be anything, it's actually nothing. So long as you feel, well, now I can write anything, there is nothing that you will write. Your inspiration and your plot construction will start only when you already have something, only when you have something specific, some entity in the line of plot. Only when you have that in mind can you begin to build. Then you can make something out of something, but you can't make it out of anything. Now what you need is the germ, the center of a plot. Since plot is essentially conflict, now you have to look for a good conflict. And let's say that you'll decide, well, in the Middle Ages, since it's a very religious period, the best figure for a conflict would be a priest. It's a particularly good symbol of the Middle Ages. Now what will you do with that priest? If he goes around practicing his religion and performing all his duties, that's not a story. There's no conflict in it. Now you've got to put him in a conflict. What will be the worst conflict possible to a priest? Well, if he is a medieval priest who really takes his religion seriously, then the best conflict possible would be for him to fall in love, because that is what his religion forbids him. If he really believes that his values all pertain to another dimension, the worst thing would be to acquire a very strong value pertaining here to this earth. Therefore, a sex passion would be the worst, the strongest possible conflict for him. And now the next question you have to ask yourself is with whom? Supposing he falls in love with a young nun who shares his values, who is also very spiritual. That might be dramatic, but it will be much more dramatic if he falls in love with someone who represents the opposite of his values. If he falls in love with a symbol of his earth, I see by your smiles that you know where I'm leading you. Supposing he falls in love with a representative of the pagan spirit, the gypsy dancer. The next question you will ask yourself, remember, your purpose is always, what is the greatest conflict you can create? Now the next question will be, does she love him or not? If she does love him, he might be in great conflict with his conscience or with society, but at least his love will be rewarded. If he is willing to betray his religion, or tempted to, for the sake of a guilty passion, then it is a much greater and more tragic, therefore stronger conflict if she doesn't love him. And the next question is, does she love anyone else or not? Obviously, it's much worse for him if she is in love with someone else. The next question is, if he attempts to pursue her in any way, will there be anyone to defend her? Yes, it will be more of a conflict if there is. Who? If it's a person who is a stranger to the priest, someone neutral or indifferent to him, that's not particularly dramatic. It's then merely factual abstraction. But what if her defender is the one man who is the symbol to the priest of his own religious duty properly performed? That is a protege, whom he brought up out of charity, who is the symbol of his proper practice, of his duty and of a Christian virtue of charity. And that is the man who turns against him to protect the girl. Now that is a pretty complex conflict. Now, pause for a moment and look at the other possibilities of the same situation. What would be the feeling or the conflict involved in the other two characters named so far? Well, the protege obviously will be in a terrible conflict between his love for the girl and his devotion to his benefactor. The girl, if she loves another man, will be torn between her love and a threat to her life. If the priest, who in the Middle Ages would be very powerful, pursues her with his demands. Now there is a plot scene. And of course you know what the result of that plot scene is. And that's Notre Dame de Paris. I'm certain that Victor Hugo did not have to go through this kind of detailed step-by-step logical analysis. He had such a genius for plot. And I mentioned that simply on the basis of the inexhaustible ingenuity for plot shown in his plays. It's obvious he would not have had to go analyzing each possible idea that way. What he had was such a good grasp of the nature of conflict that it became automatic. That it would not occur to him to write a plotless story. The idea of writing and the idea of conflict were apparently synonymous to him, or as near as a fiction writer could make it. Now, that kind of plot imagination is based on an understanding of the kind of reasoning that I was outlining to you. When a man grasps the nature of a conflict and the relationship of a conflict to a story, he doesn't have to start by asking himself, well, what would be dramatic? What is dramatic is so clear to him that the moment he gets one idea, his mind immediately integrates the others. It's introspective, would feel probably like an instinct, as if, well, it's just inspirational. I just thought of it. But the fact is that in order to get to the stage where you have this kind of inspiration, you have to understand thoroughly what is it that you're aiming at, why a conflict is good and what constitutes a conflict. Now, the kind of reasoning that I showed you is only to show you the skeleton of the approach to the selection of a plot theme. If you understand the necessity of plot, and if you understand what a conflict is and how it operates to create a plot, then at first you might have to think very slowly by a superstructure, front seat method, the way I was describing it. But after a while, you will acquire a plot instinct. Instinct, of course, in quotes. it will become automatic to you. So here I'm only showing you what it is that you must try to make automatic. I'm not suggesting that each time you compose a story, you will have to go through that much analysis. Because in fact, if you start composing a story, your mind will not go through the steps that I just outlined. You probably notice that I skip an awful lot of steps. Knowing the plot in advance, it's easy to know which kind of questions to ask. When you start from scratch, there are so many possibilities at each turn that you couldn't possibly count them nor go through them consciously. This is where you have to let your subconscious be the selector. And it can only become the selector and throw you the right possibility or make you think of the right, most dramatic situation possible only if and when you know why you need conflict and what it is. Once you're sold on that, after a little practice, it will necessarily take practice, after you've laboriously composed a few plots, you will then begin to notice that your imagination will work automatically and save you a lot of the steps. That you will automatically know when a given idea has the possibility of a dramatic conflict or when you're totally up a blind alley. Now, observe also that if what I've described of Notre Dame so far is just the plot scene, the writer's job is not finished. But the point here is that once he has arrived at this much, you can see that the possibilities are very dramatic. That once you have that kind of central setup, the rest is up to you to develop, but you now have a standard. Now you have something to go on. It isn't just some kind of story in some kind of background. Now it's not an anything anymore. You have set a limit and therefore a standard to the nature of your story. And it's in this sense that your plot scene will act as your standard of value or your standard of selection in deciding what kind of events your plot will include. If your central conflict here is a priest who is in love with a girl who doesn't love him, and he is up against his own protege, and he's trying to pursue the girl at the same time in terrible conflict with his own philosophy, with his own religious beliefs, and the girl is in dread of her life but will not surrender. Well, that is your central plot scene. It's still general. It's only a general conflict. But now you can proceed to milk that conflict. Now you know what kind of events to include in your plot in order to dramatize that conflict. And when you select the events, the same principle will be operating in your mind. That is, at each turn you have to decide what is the hardest position to put your characters in. How to make it harder and harder for them. If you give them accidental troubles on the way, your story, even with a good plot scene, will fall flat. If you know how, at each turn of the story, to bring out the strongest conflict possible, how to put them in the greatest trouble, it will be a dramatic story that will have suspense. But just as in morality, life serves as the standard of value, if you understand what we mean by standard, then in plot construction, your plot scene is the standard of value, your guide for deciding what kind of event is relevant to dramatize your sense of conflict and what kind is totally irrelevant. Then you will have a tightly constructed story because you know by what principle you will include or exclude events. If you are not clear on your plot scene, then to begin with, your story will fall apart in the sense that there will be no logical continuity, no purposeful progression. And two, you yourself will not know what to do. You will start necessarily then writing inspirationally. You will start including events or details just because you felt like it, without any knowledge as to why you felt like it. It will be purely accidental and will probably happen in your mind by the principle of association. If some scene made you feel something else, you write another scene, which has nothing to do with your central line. Your story is going nowhere, but you don't know where to go. And it's in this sense that before you can construct a story, you have to decide what is the central conflict, and that then will serve as the standard telling you what events are necessary to develop that conflict fully, and what events are sidelines and superfluous. Now, let me give you a few more examples. Not of real works now, but just of the kind of simplest things that writers can deal with. Let's suppose you want to write a love story. Now you begin with the idea there's two people in love. That's not a conflict yet. To make a conflict, you have to have their love clash with some serious value of theirs. Now supposing, taking the most trite type of story, which is very frequently used, but used precisely because it's a good plot story. Supposing they belong to opposite nations who are at war. That is already a specific conflict, or at least the possibility of a conflict. Now, if you do nothing more than have them be in love with each other while their nations are at war, and they're a boy and a girl who sit at home and long for each other, but they can't write letters, and so they sit counting the days, that's not a plot. What do you have to do to make it a plot? You have to put them into an action conflict. Now, supposing he is an officer of one army and she is a spy for the other side, and you bring them to the position where he has to either let her escape, and she has dangerous secrets that she's going to reveal, or he has to shoot her to save his country. Which will he do? Now, that's a very crude situation, but do you see where it is a properly ideal plot thing? It's the kind of conflict where a story can be built. It has enough material in it to give you the line for a story. It's not a very original story, but you know, as it has been said about bromides, they became bromides because they were good when said the first time. This kind of story is good in the technical sense, that it presents in the simplest form a kind of action conflict which can serve as a plot scene. Why are you not in this? Clear? Oh, okay. Now take another situation. Now this is a kind of pattern for if you want to write a story for happy love. Supposing you want to write a story about unrequited love. Now if you say a man is in love with a woman, but she's not in love with him, that's not a conflict yet, because the possibility of a conflict, but if he neither does anything about it, that's not a conflict. Now, supposing she has to marry him for some outside reason, to get an inheritance, or to be allowed to stay in this country, or something like that. And she doesn't love him, so she marries him in name only. She makes that arrangement. And he actually is desperately in love with her, but agrees to marry her in name only. Now you have the beginning of possibly a very good story, because conflict is immediately introduced. And observe, it's a conflict in action. Now there's one of our students here at whom these remarks are particularly directed. When I say conflict, I do not mean conflict just in a character's mind. That might be a philosophical or psychological issue, or it might be good for a non-fiction character study. But when we talk of plot, when we say conflict, we mean it has to be a conflict expressed in action. And when you're considering the construction of a plot, you have to be materialist, in quotes. You have to be concerned only with the kind of values or issues which can be expressed in physical material action. If your characters are involved in action that leads them to a conflict of values, you have a plot. If it's merely a conflict within their soul while they sit at home, that is not material for a plot. But this applies particularly to the choice of abstract themes. When you consider you have a story with an abstract or philosophical message, when you consider your theme, be sure that it's the kind of conflict that can be translated into action. If it can't be dramatized, then it's not proper material for a story, not for fiction. Now let's examine a few more possible plot scenes. For instance, you know the popularity of the theme of the prostitute with a heart of gold. I mean, that's the oldest and tritest. Ask yourself again, why is it so popular for stories or plays? Because a prostitute, to begin with, is in conflict with any other values that she might want. If that is her profession, she has in effect cut herself off from all human values. And if she ever conceives any desire for respectability, for a career, for anything, it necessarily clashes with her profession. But the worst clash possible to her, of course, will be love. If a woman in that profession falls in love, she necessarily is in a bad conflict. Therefore, the possibilities of a story, of a dramatic story, are there immediately. Now, you've all seen the kind of use that's been made of that scene. Usually, the pattern is that this prostitute falls in love with someone and decides to abandon her profession and go straight. And the man does not know about her past. So they fall in love, and the conflict thereafter is her attempt not to let him find out the truth about her. And, for instance, Anna Christie and Anna Lucasta, and I don't know how many lesser-known ones, all follow that pattern. That's a legitimate pattern. It's not too interesting a conflict. The values involved are not too great, but we're now concerned not with the quality of the values, but only the pattern of drama. Now you see that in that setup, there is a good conflict involved, in fairly good plot scene. It is the conflict of a girl who is in love with a good man and who is struggling not to let him discover the truth about her past. Usually it results, one way or the other. Either he always finds out the truth, and then either he accepts it and forgives her, and then it's a happy ending, or he denounces her and commits suicide and she jumps out of a window and it's a tragic ending according to the author's philosophy. But that's the usual resolution, and that's all that most people have done with this particular conflict. But now observe in what way it can be made much better. If you ask yourself the question, how can we make it harder for the heroine? Is this the worst possible conflict she could be in? Or is a more interesting, more dramatic conflict possible? Ask yourself what would happen if she falls in love with a man and he knows her past and he's forgiven it and he's accepted the fact that she has really reformed, that she really loves him. Only then she discovers that if he marries her, it will ruin his career, that he will never be able to succeed at what he wants if it's known that his wife is a former prostitute. And now she decides that she wants to give him up. And she knows that he will not give her up. He prefers to marry her and endanger his career. Now it's up to her to make him give her up. And the only way she can do it is by pretending that she's still a prostitute, by pretending to be exactly the thing which she hates, and hurt him terribly, and have him despise her, and do it for his own sake by pretending to be no good. And you have Camille or La Traviata, which is, I think, one of the best plot structures ever devised. As plot. I'm not now saying that that's a very serious or very inspiring conflict, but if you consider the nature of the structure and of the conflict, that is the ideal pattern. Therefore, the plot theme, to make one write that play, would have to start from this central situation, central conflict. A former prostitute who, for the sake of the man she loves, has to pretend to continue to be a prostitute in order to save him from herself. That is as tragic a conflict as anyone could be put in, and as dramatic. And incidentally, that is why that story will live forever and why there are so many bad imitations of it. But if you see in what sense that is a truly complicated conflict, you will understand better what to look for in a plot scene. Now take another tried situation. The woman who sells herself to a man she doesn't love for the sake of the man whom she does love. Now that's been used very many times. And usually the pattern is that some villain who knows of her love tells her that if she sleeps with him, he will spare her lover or something of that order, like in the opera Tosca, for instance. Usually the villain knows the heroine's position and he forces her into it. And she makes the sacrifice, and then her problem becomes how not to let the man she loves discover it. That's a simple one-line conflict, but it's a good conflict. Now ask yourself what you can make of it if you decide to make it harder for the characters involved. If instead of selling herself to a villain who forces her into it, she sells herself to a man who is really in love with her, a man whom she respects, whose love she takes seriously. She knows that he does not want to buy her, that he is really in love with her, and that she has to hide from him the fact that it's only a sale, but she has to do it in order to save the man whom she really loves, and who happens to be not a man indifferent to the buyer, but the particular man whom the buyer hates most. Now you have a much more dramatic conflict. And do you recognize what novel I'm talking about? John, I think, recognized it some time ago. I'm interested in watching the faces. Now, you see, that's the plot theme of With the Living. And do you see in what way the originality of using a pretty standard tried theme is made by means of complicating the conflict? What I have done then is ask myself, how can one make the conflict for everyone involved much worse than merely a one-line single conflict? The more conflicts you can involve in the same situation, that is, in the same action, and the more serious those conflicts, the more serious the values involved for all the participants, the better the dramatic situation, the tighter the plot that you will be able to construct out of. Now, this is just a side mention, but one that might be important here. We discussed in the lectures the nature of the climax. If you see now a little clearer what is the nature of the plot theme and the plot that you will build out of it, you will see, of course, why the climax always has to resolve that central conflict. Whichever the conflict which serves as your plot theme, it's that issue or issues that have to be resolved in your climax. Whenever you read a story and ask yourself, what is the plot theme, always ask yourself, what is the central conflict that determines the choice of events? Where is the author leading you? What is the central conflict? And after you've seen that, you can judge the author's climax by asking yourself, has the climax resolved that central conflict or not? What is the central conflict? And after you've seen that, you can judge the author's climax by asking yourself, has the climax resolved that central conflict or not? If it hasn't, then it's not a climax, then it's a badly constructed story. But the relation of plot theme to climax will be in effect thus. You start the construction of your story by deciding on your central situation, on your plot theme, your central conflict. So you start constructing it in effect from the end. You have to, from the end or near the end, you have to decide what is the conflict towards which you are building, and that is in effect the upward motion of your storyline. You reach the climax, that is the stage at which that conflict comes into full force and has to be resolved one way or the other, where the worst consequences of that conflict come into the open. And the characters involved have to make their final choice one way or another, and then you close your story thereafter. So that in effect, in constructing a story, you have to decide on the end first, then construct your line to lead to it. And in the actual writing, you do it chronologically. Start from the beginning, after you have your outline, and you come to the point at which you started. You come to your central situation and you resolve it. Then the circle is completed. But I want you to understand fully, not just as a dogmatic rule, but understand in few terms why it's necessarily so. Why you have to have that central plot theme, and why once you're clear on what your plot theme is, you will know what is the proper climax for your story. And you'll also know if you're letting your story down. If your climax does not resolve your conflict, if the conflict is just allowed to peter out, or is resolved in a manner which is not clear, or half-hearted, indecisive, so the reader does not really know what decisions the characters have made. If you escape the responsibility of resolving it, you will know that that is an improper ending. You will know you're letting your story down and that it will flop in interest at the end. But you won't have that problem if you constructed the story properly. Because if you start from the proper grasp of a plot theme, you will build your events towards it necessarily, and you won't be able to leave it unresolved. In effect, to the extent to which you have any dramatic understanding, you'll know that you'll have to resolve it. Therefore, if you have the clear understanding of plot theme, you won't have any trouble with your climax. You won't be in the position of, I've written a very good story, but I don't know how to end it. Or the thing which I think I quoted to you in my lectures, that is someone who said that everybody has written a first act of a play. Everybody is writing a play and the Broadway is full of first acts. But people are always having trouble with their third act. It's that kind of issue in regard to a play or a novel that you will avoid if you understand what is a plot theme and if you know its function. Now, I want to point out to you the smaller details of how the same principle operates in working out a story. When you go back to Notre Dame de Paris, observe that not only the central conflict is set up in a way which in principle consists of making as hard for the principles as possible. Not only are the characters, the heroes, the leading characters, put in the worst position imaginable in relation to each other, the worst meaning, the greatest conflict involved. But in the development of the story, Hugo follows the same principle about the lesser events, or rather the events by means of which he dramatizes the plot. He does not rely just on the overall drama of the conflict, but he, at each turn, each development of the story, puts his characters in the worst position possible. For instance, supposing, you know the plot of this story. Supposing the girl is arrested and she is in danger, but the priest had nothing to do with this. 3/4 of the drama of the book would be lost. If he merely stands on the sidelines and wants to help her escape from jail in order to have a love affair with her, but he was not instrumental in her trouble. That's not the plot structure. Once the author starts developing his plot theme, what he had to do is to make the events in action proceed from that plot theme. Therefore, it was dramatically necessary for the priest to be instrumental in having the girl arrested and condemned to death. If someone else did it and he merely suffered on the sidelines, that wouldn't be drama. But that he himself did it, then attempted to help her to escape or offered her to escape if she will give herself to him, that was the dramatization in action of the conflict set up in the plot scene. Next point. When, if you remember, the hobos of Paris attempt to rescue the girl from the cathedral, and there is a terrible siege. And who is one of the leaders of the siege? The priest's young brother, who was his only other human value on earth, whom he loved very much, and incidentally observe the nature of that relationship. Again, Hugo, the dramatist, made that young brother complete opposite of the priest. That is a dissolute, useless, dissipating playboy who was living too much on earth and in sin, who was a complete opposite to the priest's ideals, but he was the only human value, the only human being to whom the priest was attached at all. And it's that boy who is killed by Quasimodo, the priest's protege, in the siege of that cathedral. If you remember, there is a horrible scene there where Quasimodo seizes the boy by the legs and cracks his skull against the facade of the cathedral. Now, it's as horrible and as dramatic as possible. Again, if there were no young brother in the story, to that extent, the tragedy of the priest, the conflict of values would have been less. If there had been the siege of the cathedral, for instance, it would serve a certain plot value. It would have the plot suspense of will they succeed or not, the heroine is in danger, will she escape? There is certain dramatic conflict there. But how much more dramatic it becomes when involved in that same plot incident is a dramatic loss to the priest, who actually is the hero of that story, the villain or hero, I mean, he's the central character. When not only is he in conflict in the issue of will she escape or not, does he want her to escape? But more than that, his only other human value is lost in that same struggle. Now that is good drama and good integration. Now take a look at Quasimodo. If the priest at the end, for instance, when they watch the execution of the girl from the tower, leans forward too far and fell off the tower, that will be a disastrous anticlimax, and nothing that Hugo would ever dream of. But, if you laugh, you realize what would be wrong with it. And I want you to be very clear on what makes you laugh. That is, it's the realization of the complete purposelessness and therefore meaninglessness of that action. But if you remember, what the real dramatist did was that it's Quasimodo, the devoted monster, who, when he sees the priest gloating over the execution, pushes him over the side of the tower. There is the conflict in action for Quasimodo and for the priest. For both of them, it's horrible conflict of values, and this is the resolution. And of course, dramatically, one of the most magnificent things in Notre Dame is the few pages that follow. There is a description of the priest's coat on some kind of angle or something, a gargoyle on the wall, and he doesn't fall off completely for something like 10 minutes, if you remember. He is still alive, and the monster will not look down, and the priest knows he can't cry for help, and the description of hanging over the pavement. Now, here is a good point to illustrate the difference between melodrama and drama. You could have the same kind of device used in any cheap melodrama. That is, someone falls from a building and is caught for a moment over the street, hangs on a pole, and then collapses. There's a certain amount of suspense in it of a merely physical kind. It's just a man in physical danger who then crashes. But here, and why I cited you as an example of dramatic plot building, it was not just the physical danger. It was the total of the spiritual meaning of the whole central conflict held for a few minutes consciously. In other words, what was going on in the soul of the priest, and therefore the reader who is reading it, was the conscious realization of everything that was involved in the plot. And again, he's hanging by a thread. It's a physical illustration of what the central conflict had been and the manner in which it's now resolved. The girl is being executed on the square below. The monster is standing above and crying, and the priest is hanging between life and death in sheer horror and finally crashes to punishment. You see, if he had fallen overboard immediately, Hugo the dramatist would have known that in fact It's not dramatic enough. He, the priest, would not have had time to know what is happening to him. He's merely killed. But here, giving him time for that agony, he in effect made the conflict spiritual and dramatic rather than physical and melodramatic. He gave him time to realize what was going on. And that is one of the most satisfying resolutions of a conflict that I can think of in literature. By satisfying, I now do not mean that it's inspiring or happy, but remember I said I'm talking only in terms of dramatic values, not philosophical values nor content, not whether it's a horrible ending or a happy ending. Speaking only in terms of dramatic values, which you judge by the nature of the conflict that the author has set up. What was so magnificently skillful as resolution was the fact that he did not let that priest die immediately. If Quasimodo had killed him, that in itself would be dramatic justice and dramatically proper. But the extra touch of genius was the fact that the author did not let him be punished without knowing the nature of his punishment. He wasn't just stabbed in the back or thrown overboard. He lived long enough to know. It was a conflict, not only a physical danger, but in the last moment, the conflict was in consciousness, but illustrated in action. Now, if you understand the mechanics of what makes it good, you understand the essence of plot construction. Reading this book, you might experience feelings of horror and of drama and of interest and tension, but ask yourself always, by what means are those ends achieved? And you will see that apart from style, or rather underlying style, is always the skeleton of the plot structure, and determining that is the plot theme. If those themes at the end of Notre Dame held you, it's precisely because they were the logical resolution of the central conflict by which the author had held you up to that point. If they had come out of nowhere, if they had nothing to do with any conflict in the story, they would not hold you. Now, naturally, the author had to be good stylist to write about it properly, but that's a totally different and secondary issue. The best style in the world will not save a plotless story. You might say, yes, that's a lovely way of using words, but that's all. The power of the climax of Notre Dame is the combination not only of good writing, but above everything else, that which makes the writing good. The magnificent plot structure, magnificently resolved. If you read that novel carefully, you'll see also omitting the boring historical asides, but now that is, as I've said before, that's not Hugo's fault in effect, or his fault only in the sense that he accepted a convention which all of them practiced in the 19th century. But omit those asides and look only at the story proper and the structure of the story. You'll see that every subplot and sub-incident of the story is ruled by the same principle. Make it as hard as possible for the characters and tie the lesser characters' tragedies to the main climax, to the main line, to be resolved in the same main line. And you probably remember what the best example of that is the story of the girl's mother. Remember the old recluse who sits on that square in some kind of stone house for years and years, and her only desire is to find her daughter who had been stoned by the gypsies years ago, and she hates all gypsies, and she particularly hates this girl. And at the end, in the climax, by seizing that girl's arm, she delays her long enough so the soldiers who are pursuing her are able to find her, and in that moment discovers that that is her daughter. Now that's melodrama, but the kind of melodrama I wish we had today. That is as dramatic a subplot as possible. And you see, Hugo makes it integrated into the main story. Now that is an issue which is not involved in the plot scene. It was not essential. But in developing the story in detail, it was quite proper to introduce a lesser subplot of that kind if he could integrate it at the climax to the main line of events, which he did. In other words, that old mother would have been totally irrelevant to the story and would have been improper in the plot structure if she had not served the crucial plot purpose at the end. That is, the girl escaping, having a slim chance, was stopped by the creature who turns out to be her own mother. Again, what makes it dramatic? She was selected the worst situation possible, the worst conflict for both of them, for the old woman and the girl. In that moment, nothing worse could have happened to them than to discover each other in that manner. Again, that's a very good example of the nature of what is a conflict, the kind of conflict that can lead you to a story, or that can serve as the center of a story. You see, a situation made extremely difficult, extremely impossible to resolve for characters where two important values are involved. Now, in this connection, I want to make clear to you the difference between drama and melodrama. This is my own definition. It's not usually defined that way. By dictionaries, they usually define it melodrama as exaggerated drama. Well, that is not any kind of definition, because when you say exaggerated, the question remains, what is the line of exaggeration, or where do you draw the limits? What is exaggerated, what is not? Actually, the way I draw the difference is this. A melodrama involves only conflicts between conflicts of a man with other men. A drama involves primarily a conflict within a man, and the conflict with others will come as a consequence, of course. Try to visualize it. What do I mean by a conflict only with other men? Incidentally, I will remind you here that in the lectures, you remember I explained to you in detail why it always has to be a conflict within a man or between a man and others, but not a conflict with nature or with inanimate circumstances. Here, I will show you the distinction between the two types of conflict: the conflict with others or the conflict within yourself. The conflict with other men will be the standard pattern of a detective story or a western, where there are two sides at war, in effect, who have nothing in common with each other, but who by their opposition of interest are necessarily set against one another, like a detective pursuing a criminal. There is conflict, and a good plot can be built out of it, but all the danger, you see, will be physical and external. There is no real spiritual conflict. The detective pursuing a criminal has only one aim, to catch him, and the criminal only one aim, to escape. So you can have very interesting, suspenseful situations where, but the sole line of interest will be who will outsmart whom and how will it come out. There is no real drama. There is only a drama of action. But now suppose for a moment that the detective is pursuing a criminal, and the criminal turns out to be his own son, and you lift it from detective fiction into drama. Because then you have a spiritual conflict. You have a conflict of values within a man. Then a detective is caught between his love for the son and his duty as a policeman. All drama involves conflict within a man. The kind of stories I was outlining for you obviously all have to do with clashes of value inside a person, which have to be expressed in action and then resolved in some form of action. That is what will make Notre Dame de Paris, for instance, drama, even though the physical events are the kind that today would be called rank melodrama. That does not really make it melodrama, since those physical events are the form motivated by inner spiritual conflicts and spiritual values. But as I pointed out earlier, take that same final moment of a man suspended over a pavement, and if nothing is involved except that he slipped, and is about to fall, there will be a certain suspense in it, but that's only melodramatic suspense. Or if you take the standard gags of melodrama, a girl tied to the railroad tracks with the train about to run her over, physically, if nothing is involved but villains who put her there, that's just melodrama. But let us suppose that the man she loves put her there for whichever reason of conflict. Even so, the physical action is rather crude or too dramatic, that I would classify as drama. And for the best example of that sort of thing, I will give you Atlas Shrugged, where I consciously and deliberately use the devices of standard melodramas for a spiritual purpose. There is ending a part on a heroine crashing in an airplane, and you write end of part 2 and leave the reader in suspense as to whether she'll crash or not, but she's flying towards the earth. That is a melodrama device, and the kind that would have been used in old movie serials, which I would have liked even in that form, because there is the drama of physical action, the drama of knowing her life is in danger, will she make it or not? But when you add to that spiritual significance, when you know what she's after, whom she's pursuing, and why she's in that position, then it's drama. Same applies to the end of Atlas Shrugged. When you have Ragnar flying through a window in order to rescue Gold, and when you have all the physical action, that if no spiritual values were involved and merely some people rescuing some other person, that would be just melodrama. The moment that physical action is tied to very serious, important values, that is drama. And in that sense, I would believe with Hugo that the more melodramatic the action in which you can express the drama, the better the story. By melodramatic here I mean physical form of danger or physical action. If you can unite the two, if you can give a logical, relevant physical expression to the spiritual conflicts involved, then you have high-class drama. Now, here as an aside, I made a note before someone thinks of asking me that since I speak of conflicts within a person, what about my two heroes in The Fountainhead and in Atlas Shrugged who have no inner conflicts? That is, neither Rourke nor Gold actually have any conflict of values. But then ask yourself, if you look closer, is this true or not? In plot structures, their conflicts are really take the form of Dominic or Dagny, the main line. There are many other smaller conflicts, but the main line of their conflict is through their love for a woman who is proper. That is, it's not an improper value to hold, but who hasn't yet reached the status of the man, and therefore is still tied to the conventional world one way or another, and through her, the man is thrown in a conflict with the world in which he has something at stake. You see, he himself does not hold contradictory values in either case, but it's always through his friends or the woman he loves that he will be in conflict. That, incidentally, in my case, illustrates my philosophical premise that evil is impotent, and that it's only the good that can hurt the good if the good is mistaken. It's an illustration of what Gold was telling Dagny throughout the book. My enemies are no danger to me, you are. Now, on my kind of philosophy, a conflict like the one of the priest in Notre Dame would be impossible, because no one would hold contradictory values philosophically. If his philosophical system is consistent, then his values will be consistent. But in his conflict with the world, he will still be put in an inner conflict of values, not his own values, but then the values of those with whom he is connected and for whom he has reason to care. In the case of Rourke in The Fountainhead, for instance, if you take his struggle against society or his struggle for his career, that is not yet drama. It could almost be called melodrama if all that is involved is his action against an opposite camp, where there are no ties between them. He struggles for his values and society opposes him in the name of opposite values. That's not yet a real conflict. But when you take his relationship with Dominic, with Wynand, or with Cameron, then you're in the realm of drama. In other words, it's his struggle not just for his specific values in his career, but in effect, as a metaphor for the soul of those people who are between the two worlds, between him and society. And in any properly constructed story of anyone's struggle against society, you will see always that the elements of drama, of the inner conflict of values, are involved in the realm of values in those people who are partly in both camps. So that in very abstract terms it means the battle for someone's soul, the battle for good and evil, in which the hero then is in the position of the good struggling to save that soul, or being connected, concerned in some way with the fate of that soul, which is torn between his world and an alien world. I am making this aside to indicate to you or anticipate the kind of trouble which you might have in constructing stories on an objectivist philosophy. You might discover sooner or later that the question of, well, how am I going to put my hero in a conflict when he doesn't hold contradictory values? And that is the pattern. Now, in regard to the dullness of thrillers and mere physical action, I think too many of you know but haven't identified why mere physical action is very dull. That is, supposing you've seen melodramas where someone is chasing someone, and you have 5 minutes of speeding cars or horses galloping, and it's totally uninteresting. And you might say, well, it's action, something is going on, why is it so dull? The reason why it's dull is when melodrama goes into mere physical action, where nothing particular is involved, no conflict, no suspense. That is where it ceases to be interesting. For a chase to be interesting, there has to be something more in it than just the mere physical action of one side pursuing another. There might be some complexity of plot or some value involved. Some issue such as, if they catch them, then such and such will happen. Something at stake. But too many bad melodramas rely on the mere trappings of physical action with nothing at stake, not even a disputed value between the two sides. Then it turns into complete dullness. I want you to hold that point in mind very firmly, because too many of you, as I noticed by your work, are not yet clear on what constitutes action. Action in the plot sense. It is not spiritual action, that is, it is not action that just goes on in a man's mind, and it is not mere physical action. It is not merely the melodramatic trappings of some kind of conflict without any values at stake anywhere. Some of you, I know, make the mistake of thinking that if a man takes a trip and comes home, in effect, that constitutes action. He did something. He didn't just sit. He took a train, let's say. That's the same kind of error as the writers of the bad melodramas who think that it's action if one bunch of cowboys is pursuing a bunch of rustlers on horseback and they're running very fast. That's physical action, but that is not plot action. And in the case of conflicts within a man which are not illustrated in action, that's the counterpart of it. It's spiritual action, but it's not plot action. For a proper plot, you have to be at least as dramatist on the mind-body integrating premise. To the extent to which you hold any kind of mind and body split philosophy, to that extent it will hamper your plot development, because you will always tend either to consider dramatic if a man experiences something just in his own mind, or to consider it dramatic if a man merely runs around engaged in some hectic physical action. That the bad melodramas of that kind, or the bad westerns, on the one hand, and the very artsy, modern stream of consciousness, psychological study novels on the other, are exactly the two sides of the same medal and the two counterparts of the same error. Is the mystics of muscle and the mystics of spirit in relation to alleged plot. And just as neither representative of either philosophy is a full man, neither is that type of writer a plot writer. A plot can be done only on the premise of mind and body integration. And you understand, as an aside, that many writers might have ghastly premises, but exempt their own work, and that in relation to plot structure, whether they know it consciously or not, they are on the mind and body integrating premise, because it's the only premise that will give them the unity to devise the kind of action which is the physical expression of a spiritual conflict. Therefore, for your purposes as plot writers, be sure to check that premise and recheck it in yourself constantly, and particularly when you sit down to work. Be sure to remember that spirit alone is not plot action and body alone is not plot action. It has to be the integration of the two with the body, meaning the physical action, expressing and illustrating the inner conflict, the spiritual action involved. When you have that conflict indivisibly, when you feel that only that action could have expressed that kind of conflict, but it's the logical counterpart, then you know you have a good plot. Now, to come back for a moment to the Saturday 2 weeks ago and your mistakes in relation to the plot theme of good copy, I think you'll probably see clear by now what the nature of the mistakes were, and why you were naming, some of you were naming side issues and did not quite grasp that when you look for a plot theme, you have to look for a central conflict. Not just a one-line conflict, but a conflict sufficient to motivate or construct the rest of the story. Now, you said that we took the plot theme to be that the young man creates a challenge to overcome, namely career challenge. And real crime, how did you put it? I had it here. Fake crime and then a real criminal. You both took that somewhat as the plot theme. Now you see why that is an error. Because if only that much had been involved, if you started to build the story from scratch, and your sole conflict you had in mind is a man who fakes a crime, and then it turns into a real crime by another criminal interfering, that does not give you a conflict yet, or not much of one. It puts the hero in an uncomfortable position, but a position he can solve very easily, and therefore not much of a story can be built around that. It is in this sense that you should have looked for another element involved in the central conflict that would justify all the events of the story, that would lead to the development of all the events. Out of just the theme of a fake crime turning into a real one, no progression is yet possible. Some other element has to be added, which is the element of falling in love with the victim of the crime. Then you have a real conflict of many facets. And a conflict not only for the boy, but also for the girl. Because the fact that she fell in love and felt very happy about it does not alter the fact that falling in love with your own kidnapper is a conflict of values. Even if she immediately resolves that love is the better value, even though she's put in a somewhat conflicting position, which is not the same as falling in love with a man whom she immediately acknowledges to be a real hero, and he gives her all the evidence of only the good. And that would be a happy love, but not particularly dramatic one. If she falls in love with a criminal and then discovers, in fact, that he justifies her feeling, that is a happily resolved conflict, but it still is a conflict. And now, you made, I think, the worst mistake in identification because it either identified part of the real plot theme but not full. You missed the point totally. Because when you named as a plot theme, young man stirs up dead town. Do you see by today's discussion why that is not even a conflict? It's an action. Yes, certainly, as a result of faking the crime, he stirred up the town. But if you gave yourself as the initial assignment for the plot of a story, a young man stirs up a dead town, there's no conflict involved. Maybe the dead town is very anxious to be stirred up. He's not fighting anything. There is no clash of interest in him, nor between him and other men. For naming a line like that as a plot theme is wrong by definition. It's a line your line, that describes an action, but certainly not anything that has to do with plot action. It is not an action involving a conflict, nor any kind of values. Therefore, in analyzing any story you read, and in trying to decide what is a plot theme, always look for the central action conflict, not just action, and not just the description of the theme, but the central conflict. Now, in conclusion, I will only indicate again that to begin a plot structure, you have to begin with a conflict, but that not every conflict is sufficient to construct a story. Too many conflicts are what I call one-line conflict. It's like, for instance, the newspaperman who fakes a crime, who is then taken over by a real criminal. That alone, if you don't have any other elements involved, is a one-line conflict. And it might be good for a short story, but no more than that. It's a one-incident conflict. It's a conflict that does not permit a complex, long development. It's a conflict that is simple and therefore too easily solved. But according to the complexity of what you undertake, proceeding from a short story to novelette to play to full novel, your central plot theme has to be a conflict complex enough to warrant the development of events on the scale which you intend. That is, if you want a novel, your central plot theme has to be a much more complicated conflict than what would suffice for a short story. And therefore, as a definition, I would tell you this, that a plot theme is a conflict in terms of action, complex enough to create a purposeful progression of events. If you want to write it down, I'll repeat it. Shall I? A plot theme is a conflict in terms of action, complex enough to create a purposeful progression of events. And if you remember that this last is our plot definition, you will see in what way your plot theme has to serve as the seed from which the whole tree has to grow, and what you have to learn to recognize is, do you have sufficient seed for a good tree? The test of whether you have or not is the complexity, but a particular kind of complexity. Always ask yourself the question, is this the worst possible situation in which I can put my hero considering his values? If these are the values I ascribe to him, if these are his values, is it the worst possible clash that I can engineer between his values set up? If you have chosen the worst clash possible, and if the values are important enough, you have a good seed for a good plot theme and therefore a good plot structure. And with that, I will hope the results will show in your future work. I'll see by your future work whether this has helped you with plot or not.